Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Lewis McGlynn. My guest this evening is activist and Broadcasting Scotland regular William Duguid. Good evening, William.
Good evening to you, Lewis. Nice to see you again so soon after the last time.
Hope you're doing well.
Yep, and you.
Starting off tonight with our Ukraine update on day 474 of the conflict. Ukraine's armed forces have claimed to have liberated several frontline villages in western Donetsk, almost a week after the launch of counter-offensive operations. Soldiers were shown in video footage raising the Ukrainian flag over the village of Blahotne, south of the town of Velika Novosilka, one of the main axes of the counter-offensive so far. Troops from another brigade filmed themselves with their unit's brother in Neskuchne. Later on Sunday, Kiev said a third village, Makarivka, had been taken. Ukraine's Deputy Defence Minister, Hanna Maliar, announced the liberation of Storozhve by Ukrainian Marines on Monday morning. Ukraine's top military command said on Monday that its forces were engaged in heavy battles in frontline hotspots. 25 battles had taken place over the past day near the eastern town of Bakhmut and further south near Avdiivka and Mariinka, all in the Donetsk region, and also near Belarovka in the Luhansk region, Ukraine's Armed Forces General Staff has said. US think tank the Institute for the Study of War said that Ukrainian forces had made visually verified advances in the Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia regions, and that Russian sources confirmed but sought to downplay those advances. The water level at the ponds used to cool the reactors at Ukraine's Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant remained stable and sufficient despite the falling water level of the Kakhovka reservoir nearby, Ukraine's environment minister said on Monday. Pavlo Kyrylenko, Ukraine's governor of Donetsk, reported that Avdiivka was struck twice by rockets on Monday morning. A 50-year-old woman was injured as a result of shelling by the Russian military in the village in Novoselivka in the Zaporizhzhia region. Russia's defense ministry said today it had signed a contract with the Akhmat group of Chechen special forces a day after mercenary chief Yevgeny Prigozhin refused to do so. The signing followed an order that all volunteer units should sign contracts by the 1st of July, bringing them under the control of Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. On Sunday, Yevgeny Prigozhin said he would refuse to sign any such contract. Work has already started in an investigation by the International Criminal Court over the breach of the Kakhovka Dam in Ukraine and the vast flood it triggered, Volodymyr Zelensky has said. 3 civilians were killed Sunday and 10 others wounded after Russian forces opened fire on a boat carrying flood evacuees to the Ukrainian-controlled city of Kherson. A 74-year-old man used his body as a shield to shield a woman from Russian fire and was hit in the back. Russia's defense ministry said Ukraine had made an unsuccessful attempt at the weekend to attack a vessel off of its Black Sea fleet, which was protecting natural gas pipelines. Our top story tonight. First Minister Humza Yousaf was in Inverness today to officially open the National Treatment Centre Highland. Despite being there on Scottish Government business, the First Minister faced questions from the media about whether he would suspend Nicola Sturgeon from the party. Mr Yousaf said that he saw no reason to suspend Miss Sturgeon. The First Minister was more interested in discussing the new state-of-the-art NTCH, which offers ophthalmology and orthopaedic services to surrounding communities in a new and unique purpose-built facility. Mr Yousaf heard from the clinical teams about their NTCH journey and was also able to chat to patients during a tour of the facility. First Minister Humza Yousaf said, "I was very pleased to formally open the National Treatment Centre Highland and to see the huge difference that this state-of-the-art facility is making to people locally and from across the country. The Scottish Government is focused on reducing NHS backlogs built up over the course of the pandemic, and our investment in a network of national treatment centres will provide significant additional capacity for orthopaedics, ophthalmic and diagnostic treatment. This is the second of 4 NTCs to open this year. Fife NTC opened in March, with Forth Valley and the second phase of the NHS Golden Jubilee to come. These purpose-built facilities will help to reduce waiting times worsened by the pandemic, so people can get the care they need as soon as possible." As we came on the air this evening, it was announced that Boris Johnson has formally resigned by accepting the post of Crown Steward and Bailiff of the Chiltern Hundreds. to preempt a damning verdict from the House of Commons Privileges Committee. William, with this being the second of these NTC facilities being opened by the Scottish Government, how do you feel that they have been managing thus far, managing the day-to-day responsibilities?
You mean how has the government been managing its day-to-day responsibilities? Has it been doing the day job? It looks as if it has. Certainly, I think that this is tackling one of the big problems that the NHS has got right now, which is the backlog caused by COVID. So it's good to see those new facilities now beginning to appear, and hopefully they will make a dent in it, because if we can get the backlog sorted out, then I think probably, although it's always going to be a squeeze for money under the current constitutional settlement, NHS Scotland will actually be in pretty good shape. So I think geographically, they've got the right spread, and I think it's the right way to go about things. And, things are happening. It's not just a promise of 40 hospitals like you get down the road. It's something that's actually likely to make a difference in the here and now. And it's good to see that Hamza was not going to ground, but taking the hard questions at a time when he was actually doing the day job and being seen to do it. And that's quite important.
This obviously comes at a fairly interesting time with him facing these difficult questions, as you say. But down in south of the border, we have Boris Johnson announcing his resignation. What do you make of that?
Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens next with the resignation, and of course the other two, Nadine Dorries and Nigel Evans, also going. On the face of it, it looks like a cowardly act, not wanting to face the music. But more importantly, it really is actually an attack on Rishi Sunak's government. And first of all, by causing by-elections that they would rather not have, even though in many cases, or in certainly two of the cases, they've got fairly significant majorities. But also you have to wonder what the longer game is. It's highly unlikely that any of the three will be coming back as official candidates for the Tories again. So are they thinking in terms of maybe forming a new party? That's one of the suspicions that people have voiced. And would that be one that attempted to perhaps soak away some of the sort of right wing that the Tory party has occupied for a little while, and sort of gain that ground for themselves? And if that were to be the case, that would not be a particularly welcome development, I think, because there is quite a lot of opinion in England that really thinks Boris Johnson's a great guy and would love to follow that line of politics. And I think it's something that's completely out of tune with what we have in Scotland, and not something I'd like to see. But with Boris, you just never know. He keeps coming back and coming back and coming back. So let's find out what happens over time.
Thank you, William. Do you think that with Boris Johnson resigning from this post, it could be the first step to perhaps for him seeing himself rise to the House of Lords?
I think that would be a fairly unlikely development right now. You never know in the longer term, though. It's all part of the whole gravy train thing of power and influence. You eventually look at his own list that he submitted, of which eight names had to be removed because they were just inappropriate. I think it's not impossible that a future Prime Minister will nominate Boris for the Lords, but I think to do so in the short term would be a catastrophic thing to attempt.
Do you think, perhaps as catastrophic as it may be, it would sort of get him out of the way for, like you said earlier, of Rishi Sunak's way?
It would stop all the nonsense about if he is going to form another party or cause trouble. But of course, putting him in the Lords will, as well as giving him an income for life, although he's probably quite well off anyway, it'll put him in a position where he will have influence because he does have a groundswell of support, and you would be giving him a voice. And he would automatically find his way onto all the organs of publicity. So I don't think you will ever get him out the way, to be honest. So I suppose it's a question of what does the least damage. And maybe right now putting him into the Lords is going to cause more trouble than it's worth.
Thank you, William. The UK will be left with deep scars from the pandemic, despite narrowly escaping a second recession within 3 years and growing signs of an economic pickup, according to new forecasts. A new report by the accountancy firm KPMG has found that the economy has enjoyed a better start to the year than it had thought, and is now expected to grow by 0.3% this year, compared with its previous prediction of an uplift of just 0.1%. However, UK households and businesses are set to suffer more financial pain, with the Bank of England expected to raise the base interest rate, currently 4.5%, 3 more times this year in order to tame the stubbornly high rate of inflation. We've seen a slightly stronger momentum for the UK economy, said Yale Selfin, chief economist at KPMG UK. The UK economy has so far avoided a technical recession, but risks are still elevated. A stickier inflation will see monetary policy tightening even further, increasing the risk of unwelcome side effects, among other potential headwinds. KPMG said that while inflation eased to 8.7% in April, down from 10.1% in March, and a peak of 11.1% last October, it was not falling as fast as had been hoped. The firm expects the bank to continue its run of 12 consecutive increases in the base rate of interest, hitting a peak of 5.25% later this year. The CBI, the embattled business lobby group, said 2023 would prove challenging for households and businesses. For the first time since the recession of the early 1980s, it expects a real household incomes, a measure of living standards, to fall for 2 successive years. William, what do you make of these further increases to the investment in the midst of this cost of living crisis?
Well, I know that there's certainly, and I think we've maybe got a story later on also about this. It's a concern. It's a very blunt tool, it seems to me, for bringing down inflation, and by no means all economists are of the opinion that it's actually helping. It's a problem for people who have mortgages to pay for a start, and if they can't pay their mortgages, or if they struggle to pay their mortgages, they can't pay for other things, then that slows down the economy in itself. Now, of course, slowing down the economy may be seen as a good thing by the ivory towers, but it's not a good thing for ordinary people because it affects the standard of living for everyone. And of course, it's not just mortgages, but people who are needing credit at all are now paying much more for it. We're much more highly leveraged than we ever were 20 or 30 years ago, when interest rates were generally higher. And on top of that, we were greatly weakened by the pandemic. The economy has got deep scars still from the pandemic. It's only just bumping along the bottom. And it seems to me that if people aren't in a position to spend money, then it isn't going to recover very fast. So you have to ask, is this the treatment? If it's the only treatment, is it killing the patient? Or if it's not killing the patient, is it at least causing the patient an awful lot of pain that you wouldn't want to be caused otherwise? So it's not a very satisfactory state of affairs, and it looks as if even if interest rates start to come down, they'll remain fairly high for a time to come. And even though inflation is going to come down, if it results in a pretty well wrecked, enervated economy, then that's a kind of Pyrrhic victory. So not a satisfactory outcome all along, and I think this will be a theme tonight.
So do you think that the people who are struggling the most under this cost of living crisis are also the ones who seemingly are going to suffer even more from these allegedly necessary steps to reduce inflation?
Yeah, I think so. I think in all cases, when economic times are hard, it's the people who are less well off and struggling that are hit the hardest. Even if you can afford your mortgage, if you're not spending elsewhere in the economy, that just goes through to everybody. And inevitably, it's the people that have got the least who have to put up with all the issues that come about. And that sort of effect can stay in the economy for a very long time. In the meantime, I've no indication that the people who are perfectly well off and creaming it in at the moment are suffering any great diminution in their standard of living. So it's an incredibly unequal way of looking at things. If you add to that the continuing B word, Brexit, a lot of the effects of which were hidden by the pandemic, but which haven't fully worked out, it's generally going to be a struggle. I mean, real household incomes down for 2 successive years. That takes us back to a time that people remember with a shudder. And that would be back in the 80s and 90s, in the Thatcher years, when there was a recession then. And it may not stop there. And I admit that other countries are struggling a little bit as well, but it just seems to me that in the UK, we have a perfect storm right now. And yes, it always hits the worst off.
Santander is the latest major bank to announce it is temporarily pulling its mortgage deals for new borrowers off sale as the turmoil in the home loans market shows no signs of abating. Days after HSBC temporarily pulled down the shutters, Santander told mortgage brokers that it would stop accepting new applications for its new business, residential, and buy-to-let fixed and tracker rates at 7:30 p.m. on Monday, with deals not becoming available again until Wednesday the 14th of June. The move applies to applications made via mortgage brokers and online, though Santander said new deals for existing customers remained available and that those people who applied before 7:30 p.m. would not be affected. Meanwhile, the SNP have warned that millions of households could be worse off by thousands of pounds a year as of 2024 due to unsustainable rises to their mortgage payments. The warning follows a YouGov poll which suggested that 32% of people blame the UK government for high interest rates amidst the cost of living crisis. Recent analysis by Capital Economics found that 3.2 million UK households are currently paying interest rates of 3% or more, which is likely to rise to 5.8 million households by the end of next year. Commenting, the SNP's economy spokesperson, Stuart Hosey MP, said, "As households are already grappling with the effects of the Tories' cost of living crisis, they're set to have even more misery piled on top with their unsustainable rises to their mortgage payments. Households need to see action from the Tory UK government, who have continued to sit on their hands throughout this cost of living crisis of their making. Brexit and the Tories' reckless economic mismanagement has forced unnecessary suffering on far too many households while making the possibility of home ownership for others little more than a pipe dream." Now, William, there's that B word coming up once again. You mentioned earlier Brexit, and with more and more banks making these similar measures, things like seems are getting harder and harder every day.
Yeah. As I said, it's a perfect storm. Mortgages are not discretionary spending for households. You can always sort of forego your really expensive Christmas presents for a year, and you can eat a little bit more cheaply, but you can't escape your housing costs. And you mentioned that the numbers that would be affected would increase. And the reason for that is because they're currently on lower fixed rates, but they will face higher ones as soon as those deals come to an end. And they're locked in. There's nothing they can do about it. And that is what is depressing spending everywhere else. So it's a whole mix of things. It's Brexit and the pandemic, and mainly, although, the reaction to it, which, as I say, is one tool to solve everything, and it doesn't solve everything. It creates more problems. And to illustrate how highly leveraged we all are now, when I first had a house, I got married in 1989, bought a house, we had interest rate of 12.5% fixed. But our mortgage was a 95% mortgage, but it was only £80,000. So it was a struggle so we could get by. That same property now would cost 3 to 4 times the amount that we paid for it. And I can be pretty sure that our fairly early in our careers salaries would not have gone up by that amount. And therefore, that's the sort of bill that people are now facing month upon month. And it's going up, and it's showing no great signs of going down. And so you now get other issues like, will we have 35-year mortgages, not 25 years, spread the cost? More money, of course, for the banks and mortgage companies. We have that coming on top of other things such as student debt in England. I honestly don't see how you track your course through life it seemed so simple. I thought it was hard when I did it, but it seemed so simple 30 or 40 years ago. Now I don't envy folk one little bit. And it's hard to see how we get out of this without a radical change in thinking.
Would you agree with Stuart Hose's stance that the UK government has been sitting on their hands, as he put it, in response to this cost of living crisis?
Well, looking after interest rates has been the purview of the Bank of England now ever since Gordon Brown made it that way in the early days of the Blair government. So to an extent, there's not a lot that they can do except take control of interest rates back and force them down. But nevertheless, there are other things they can be doing with the economy that might make life a bit easier, and certainly continuing to help people who are still going to suffer from high energy costs would be one. Looking at supply chains and keeping them going, and doing something about getting more workers into the country, which is one of the things that happened with Brexit. Hey, they might even rejoin Europe at some stage, but it doesn't look possible right now. So there are other things they can do in the longer term to make things better. But as I say, we seem to be in a perfect storm right now. So I'm not sure there's that much the government can do about the interest rates, but ride it out and help people as best they can.
Thank you, William. The Bank of England may need to increase interest rates further to tackle inflation, despite mounting pressure on households from the rising cost of borrowing, a senior Bank of England policymaker has warned. Jonathan Haskell, an external member of the Rate Setting Monetary Policy Committee, MPC, said the UK Central Bank could not rule out more hikes given concerns about stubbornly high rates of inflation. Suggesting the pinch felt by households from surging borrowing costs on mortgages and loans was a price worth paying to tackle inflation, Haskell, a professor of economics at Imperial College's Business School, said the Bank of England recognised the pressure households and businesses were under, but warned persistently high inflation had wider economic costs as well. The bank has raised interest rates 12 times in succession since December 2021, from a record low of 0.1% to 4.5%, the highest level since the 2008 financial crisis. Financial markets give a 100% probability of rates being raised further at the next meeting of the MPC on the 22nd of June to at least 4.75%, with the expectation that rates will hit close to 5.5% before the end of the year. Now, William, it seems like we just keep coming back to these interest rates and the effect that they're going to have on households in this country.
Yeah, this seems to me from the Bank of England to be ivory tower talk. The people who are making these decisions don't actually live with the day-to-day consequences. And to talk about the wider economic costs, well, economic costs to whom? And for whom does the economy, or is it supposed to work? Is it working for the people, or are the people working for the economy? There is no point in hammering people when you could perhaps adopt a slightly more lenient long-term approach, because it's quite possible that the existing interest rate increases, as we said earlier, hasn't worked through to everybody, and therefore maybe they haven't had their full effect yet. Also, wage settlements are falling generally below inflation. They've certainly peaked below inflation. So there's a question about whether that isn't in turn going to have an effect. They are expecting inflation to fall by the end of the year, maybe not by as much as they thought, but I would be tempted, if I were them, and that's probably why I'm not them, to just give it a bit longer. And I think people like Richard Murphy, somebody I do admire, and do read his blog, everybody, would agree. He thinks that the Bank of England is actually damaging the economy by insisting on continuing to increase interest rates.
Thank you, William. Homicides in Scotland remain at the lowest level since modern crime recording began, and the 48 recorded during the 2022 to 2023 period was the lowest number in any year. The figures are highlighted in Police Scotland's latest policing performance report, which also outlines an exceptional and demanding period for policing, reflecting the changing needs of the communities. Deputy Chief Constable Fiona Taylor, QPM, said, "The performance report underlines that Scotland is a safe place to live and work, and when criticality does arise, Police Scotland responds with high levels of operational competence. Since the service was formed 10 years ago, Police Scotland's extremely high detection rate continues. Only one homicide is undetected, and that remains under investigation. Each one is an individual tragedy with unique circumstances and investigative challenges. Securing justice for families and loved ones is a core duty for Police Scotland and important for police legitimacy." William, what do you make of these figures? It seems like quite a good sign for Police Scotland.
I think it's very good. When you consider that when the murder rate peaked in 2004, 2005, when it was, I think, something like 3 times the number just recorded, we've certainly come a very long way from that. But at that time, according to the United Nations, we were the most violent country in the developed world. I think that description was a little bit of overkill when you take into account US gun statistics, but nevertheless, that statement was made, and it certainly could not be made now. And it's a lot of hard work has gone into reducing the figure over time, a lot of different understanding about how the statistics arose in the first place too. One thing that was notable about 2004, 2005, when we had the peak, was that Glasgow knife crime was a huge contributor to that. And that was the sort of thing that led to Strathclyde Police creating the Violence Reduction Unit that saw the incidence of murder as a social and public health problem as much as anything else, and therefore adopted community-based ways of trying to bring it down. And that was highly successful. And so that is one thing that set us on the right path. But the other thing, I think, has been the technology, particularly DNA, which has allowed detection to be much easier. And I think the high detection rate in itself is probably a disincentive to murder. So that's a good thing. The other notable thing is that we're beginning to clear up some very old cold cases, such as ones from the 1970s, Brenda Page and Renee McCrae and her son. Those have been cleared up, and it's a good set of statistics. But we must never forget, yes, every one is too many, and every one is a tragedy for a family and pain for them that will never go away. So we need to keep at it and keep the detection rates up, but also keep the community side of things up, and not forget where we are and all the sort of difficult circumstances we've been in. But overall, it's a good news story, and I'm glad we reported it.
You mentioned there that one of the most effective measures was these more community-focused programs focusing on almost the root causes of issues rather than responding. Do you think these community initiatives could be applied in other areas outside of homicide to perhaps equally good results?
Well, one area in which it definitely could, I'm pretty sure, would be drugs, where the figures are still incredibly high, and Scotland is kind of stymied from using the sort of community-based, health-based approaches that it would like to, because the UK government, who has authority over it, has reserved to them, sees it purely as a crime issue and not a health issue. So I think that would certainly be something. There may be others as well, but that's the one that leaps out at me.
Thank you, William. Exhumations at the Valley of Cuil-Magamoros, known until last year as the Valley of the Fallen, are set to begin after the families of some of those interred there spent almost 2 decades fighting for their loved ones to receive a dignified burial. Forensic scientists will begin the task of exhuming the remains of 128 people from the huge basilica outside Madrid, where 34,000 dead from both sides of the Spanish Civil War were buried, and where the body of General Francisco Franco also lay for almost half a century. The basilica, 40 miles outside of the Spanish capital, was partly built by political prisoners used as forced labour, and is ostensibly dedicated to the memory of all those killed in the 1936-39 conflict. However, only 2 of the graves beneath the basilica's 150-metre cross were ever marked, those of Franco and Primo de Rivera, the founder of the fascist Falangist party. Franco's body was removed from the site by Spain's socialist government in 2019. Primo de Rivera's remains were exhumed and relocated 2 months ago. The site still holds the bodies of 33,800 people, Republicans and nationalists, which were disinterred from resting places across Spain and reburied anonymously, often without their families' permission, in the church in an apparent attempt at post-war reconciliation. The exhumations, which have been meticulously planned, come 8 months after Spain passed a historical memory law to bring justice, reparation, and dignity to the victims of the Spanish Civil War and subsequent dictatorship. Among its provisions was the creation of a census and a national DNA bank to help locate and identify the remains of the tens of thousands of people who still lie in unmarked graves. A ban on groups that praise and defend the Franco regime, and the redefinition of the Valley of the Fallen to end its glorification of Franco and his dictatorship. Although 21,000 sets of remains were taken there with the knowledge and permission of the families, and those from the nationalist side were labelled with names and surnames, the remainder arrived in boxes stating only how many bodies they contained and which town they came from. On Monday morning, Isabel Rodriguez, a spokesperson for Spain's socialist-led coalition government, said the long overdue exhumations were intended to bring dignity to the dead and to their families. Some of the relatives of those whose bodies are being exhumed are worried at how long the process has taken and now fear that if the Conservative People's Party return to power, they will repeal the law before their loved ones' remains are retrieved. William, what do you make of this news story?
It seems to me amazing how long it takes to resolve the issues that people have with a big event such as the Spanish Civil War, because it seems to me that this cemetery originally was put together in a very cack-handed way. It was ostensibly to the memory of all those killed, but it was done in a very haphazard way, with graves not always marked, a bunch of shoeboxes stacked up, that then water got in and started to mingle the bones. It's just horrific for the families of those who died. And it's taken 80 to 90 years until this is beginning to be resolved. And would you believe it, there's a political party that might get in at the election in a month's time that might repeal all the law to make things better for them. And so it's amazing how people keep pressing for things to be fixed, even though they're getting nowhere. And I very much hope that they do get the reward, and that they feel that their loved ones are actually put to rest with some dignity, and that another party doesn't just come along and spoil it. Because, they're getting on a bit, some of them, these relatives, even the sons, daughters, and grandchildren. And so these folk deserve a rest, and this chapter of history needs to be put properly into an end and a good perspective.
I think that is a real concern for some of these families, of just due to how long this process has taken to begin with, that it may not get there in time. And if this does get repealed, then it's just back to the campaigning that's already been going on for decades now.
Yeah. This is typical of the way governments act with big problems like that. Look how long, not nearly as long, but look how long it took to get any sort of justice for the Hillsborough families. This is just the way governments are. It's not good enough, but it's where we are. And therefore, it's down to the ingenuity and the just keeping at it that people do to get any change at all in these things. And I take my hat off to them, and I really hope they get what they deserve.
The UK government has been warned that thousands of Afghan refugees in the UK are facing homelessness this summer. Council officials told Number 10 and Home Office civil servants at a secret crisis meeting in Downing Street that about 8,000 Afghan refugees allowed into the country in 2021 under the slogan Operation Warm Welcome are due to be evicted from hotels as early as August because of a government deadline, yet have nowhere to go due to a shortage of housing. Last Thursday's emergency meeting came just hours before the Prime Minister quietly dropped the controversial plank of last year's asylum law that had introduced a two-tier refugee system. On Sunday, a Westminster parliamentary committee said his illegal migration bill breaches a number of international human rights obligations and would mean that the UK is turning its back on the vast majority of refugees. In a damning report, the Joint Committee on Human Rights urged the UK to fulfil its role in the global system of refugee protection and not walk away from its legal obligations to refugees, children, and victims of modern slavery. The report by the Joint Committee on Human Rights warns that if the bill is passed in its current form, the UK would fail to meet its obligations under international human rights law. These failures would include denying refugees access to the asylum system and severely restricting human rights claims, denying protection to modern slavery victims, and removing the right of appeal after age assessments. Committee Chair Joanna Cherry queried a claim by Home Secretary Suella Braverman that the bill was compatible with international law. Cherry said, "We disagree. Having carried out scrutiny of the bill, it is overwhelmingly clear that it breaches a number of the UK's international human rights obligations." She also questioned its impact on children seeking sanctuary in the UK. The bill falls far short on providing the protection children need and deserve. If this bill is passed, it is likely to have a disproportionate impact on vulnerable groups. William, how do you feel about the government's response to this situation?
I think the government's refugee policy, the UK government's refugee policy, has been a mess from the start and continues to be a mess. And it almost looks as if this August deadline that they had put in there for getting refugees out of hotels with nowhere to go has crept up on them, because last Thursday's meeting seemed to be a crisis meeting. And this is characteristic of their whole approach. It's slapdash and, hey, almost as if they don't care. And I suspect to a certain extent that's absolutely right, because certainly in England, it's not a vote winner to be kind to refugees. And the whole legal framework, all the way back to Theresa May's hostile environment and before, but all the more these days, is pretty well designed along these lines. And so they're looking at potentially huge numbers of people being put out in the street, and their solutions are maybe dealing with about a 50th of them. And whether they're decent solutions or not, that's not even going to scratch the surface. So they need to look at the whole thing and work better at it. There's a big problem coming, as I say, time and time again. This problem will not end. You might be able to put some sort of a stop to illegal trafficking if you have proper routes and a proper system for dealing with refugees, but you are certainly going to be looking, not just you, but every country in the world not affected badly by climate change over the next 20, 30 years, you're going to have to look at how you do this in an elegant, humanitarian fashion that values human beings for who they are. And we're a long, long way from that, certainly in terms of the UK policy. What used to be Operation Warm Welcome for the Afghan refugees is now Operation Cold Shoulder, and that is simply not good enough.
It seems quite telling of the UK government's real attitude towards refugees to use a slogan like Operation Warm Welcome, only to turn around and leave them in hotels for months and then eventually just kick them out onto the street with no real no way forward, seemingly.
It's a fairly standard thing in government policy. You put a label on something without doing the thinking behind it, without necessarily wanting to do the thinking behind it. And then things just overtake you. And even if you look at it in economic terms, as they undoubtedly are doing, because they keep telling us it costs $3 billion a year to deal with the refugee crisis, well, it'll be more of a crisis if you don't deal with it properly, and you'll spend even more money on it. And you'll probably make things worse anyway. So the whole thing needs a change in attitude. That's basically what it has to boil down to.
Thank you, William. There will be more support for unaccompanied asylum-seeking and trafficked children arriving in Scotland thanks to a new statutory guardianship service. The Scottish Government has provided £1 million for the Guardianship Scotland service in 2022 to 2023 and a further £1 million annually for the next 2 years initially. The service will support children who have arrived in Scotland alone and help guide them through the asylum process. Aberlour Children's Charity and the Scottish Refugee Council have been awarded the contract to run the service. Professionals employed by the service, known as guardians, will accompany young children and young people when they claim asylum and support them with expert advice, empower children and young people in the decision-making process, listen to the experiences of affected children and young people and explain what is happening to them. Launching for the service, Minister for Children and Young People Natalie Dawn said, "It is a privilege to help launch this new guardianship service, which is another example of how Scotland is offering a welcome environment to people arriving in our country. Arriving alone can have a devastating and lasting impact on the lives of children and young people, so it is vitally important for them to be given access to the care and support they need to help them adjust to their new life here. I look forward to working with the Scottish Refugee Council and Aberlour to ensure that we are getting it right for all of the young people in need of our support." Well, this comes in almost quite stark contrast to our last story, where the UK government is putting people out on the street. The Scottish government is allocating funding and starting these new projects to help welcome some of the most vulnerable people in the form of children and young people into the country.
Yeah, it's chalk and cheese. It's chalk and cheese in terms of attitudes. Now, if only the Scottish Government had a big slug of money to put into bringing refugees into the country in an elegant and humanitarian way, that would be great. As it is, they can spare £1 million to do it, and that is certainly better than nothing, and it will make a difference. But what is the key thing? Yeah, is the change in attitude. And I think that attitude is reflected in Scottish society generally. We are, I think, much more open to refugees and to people coming from abroad in general, because we know the difference that it makes to our population, and that's a good difference. It just gives us a better working age population over time, and it makes us just a more open and worthwhile society. We don't pull up the drawbridge. And it's important, certainly with this particular problem, that children who have been through unimaginable trauma, that will be with them for the rest of their lives, very likely, they need all the support they can get. And even with just a small amount of money, the Scottish Government is doing something about it. And yes, the UK Government could certainly take a number of leaves out of their notebook on that one.
Do you think it reflects quite badly on the UK government that the Scottish government is doing seemingly much more with much fewer, much less means to work with than the English government, the UK government, who have far greater in terms of resources and yet seemingly have very little to offer?
Well, to a certain extent, I have to be careful here, it reflects the two societies. I think Scottish society is intrinsically different from certainly southeast of England society in its approach to foreigners in general. We were always much keener in the EU for a reason, because we knew that it was actually a good thing to have this mix of people coming from all over the place being part of society. There is a strain of politics in England particularly, which is a right-wing dog whistle politics that does not like foreigners, would like fewer of them and just pull up the drawbridge and be an island. Not that England's an island, but it would love to be. Actually, I'd love it to be. We could float away from them and do things properly. So whether or not it reflects badly on the English government, I think the English government reflects what its voters want. And it's not what Scottish voters want. It's an entirely different thing, and that's where the difference lies.
Thank you, William. The Scottish Government has published new rules which mean that all new buildings in Scotland are fitted with climate-friendly heating systems. The new regulations before Parliament will go live in April 2024 if passed, and directly meet a commitment in the Butte House Agreement. Scotland's Heat in Buildings strategy sets out the Scottish Government's intention to develop regulations to ensure that new buildings applying for a building warrant from 2024 onwards use zero direct emissions heating systems. A direct emission heating system means a system other than a heat network by which the building is heated or is cooled, or by which hot water is made available in the building, which uses thermal energy produced by a source of production, which during normal operation produces more than a negligible amount of direct greenhouse gas emissions at the point of use. Minister for Zero Carbon Buildings, Patrick Harvey, said, "Along with transport, heating Scotland's homes and buildings is one of the biggest contributors to our carbon emissions, and we know we have to take bold action to meet our climate obligations. These regulations will mean that direct emissions heating systems, like gas boilers, will no longer be installed in new homes and non-domestic buildings. Instead, they will be replaced by climate-friendly alternatives like heat pumps and heat networks. This change is essential to deliver our commitment to make buildings zero carbon by 2045. It will also mean that people who buy new homes will know that their home is future-proofed against the need to have to switch heating systems in the future. It is another example of how Scotland is leading the way in addressing the big challenges that we need to solve to meet our net zero targets and making sure we have buildings that meet the needs of the 21st century." Another seemingly quite positive story here, William. What do you make of these new regulations?
It's a positive story in that it prevents an existing problem from getting any greater. And I think Patrick Harvey, I hope he was very much informed by the climate assembly that took place, I think, last year, which I know he was involved in, and some of the people I know here in Perth were also involved in, because they were very much looking at housing and how that should be in order to be zero carbon, and also, of course, future-proof. That's very important. So to do that with new buildings is a great thing, and I certainly welcome these new standards in that regard. There might be somebody in the building lobby that doesn't like it very much because it increases their costs, but I'm afraid that is tough cheese in the circumstances. A bigger problem that still has to be properly thought through, and I acknowledge that probably the resources don't exist to deal with it, is the retro-working of existing houses to make sure that they are properly insulated so that they don't lose heat. That is a huge, huge issue, and I don't know quite how we do that, but we have basically got 20 years or so to work it out. And if we can do that, then we will start to really make an impact in our own little way. And I would commend to everybody the Commonweal Green New Deal, which has that and much more in its pages about how to deal with housing in future. And I'll be quite happy to post Patrick Harvey a copy if he wants one.
So you think that this is a good step, but a first step, and that there are more measures that need to be taken in order to continue to meet these net zero demands?
Yeah, it's a huge and complex problem, and it's going to take a lot to fix. I don't necessarily see the money coming all that easily from the UK government to do it, and as you will not be surprised, I would much rather that we were an independent country with the powers to do what we want and the ability to either create or borrow the money to do it as an investment in our future. To be an independent country in that way doing these things, I think we could make a real difference, and we could be a beacon. So let's get there if we possibly can, but let's do what we can in the interim.
Speaking of the interim, do you think there are any shorter term measures that we could start implementing just now while tackling these larger problems almost in the background, perhaps something like solar panels, for example?
Solar panels are interesting because they're kind of a double-edged sword. We're going to have a whole bunch of solar panels that are going out of use that will be difficult to get rid of in a little while. So there's a growing feeling that solar panels might be a bit of a menace. But I do think that money is the problem. Money is always going to be the problem because the Scottish budget is limited. So we probably can't do very much on a big scale, but we can certainly try, and I would suggest, in terms of retrofitting old homes, maybe we should look at how we can expand grants to households to do that for themselves. I'd love to do it in a totally organised fashion, and Commonweal would certainly love that. If you read the Green New Deal, I mean, it's the most organised book you ever saw in your puff. But I think that's probably the best we can hope for.
Thank you, William. Well, that is about it for this evening, but before I go, I just want to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So, to everyone who has donated, and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new subscribers to enable us to employ staff to make more programmes. Good night, and thank you for watching.